Hello, everybody. We're back. Week 5. Here we go. Let's dive right in. Okay. Continuing from last week. So now the colonists are definitely at war. And as I mentioned last week, once the declaration was signed, there was no turning back. But 1776 was a disaster, right? Only the victory that a miraculous victory of Washington at Trenton on Christmas of 1776 and the Battle of Princeton in early January 1777 keeps the entire Continental cause from falling apart, right? So now, of course, the colonists have to settle into the very difficult reality that this is going to be a long, hard war. And they are not as militarily prepared as they thought they could be. Maintaining, equipping an army is extremely expensive, much harder than they thought it was going to be. And now the colonists find out what the practical challenges, we'll call it, of running a government in wartime. In particular, they had some challenges with how to pay for the war, right? I talk about this a lot. But one of the genuine problems with the way their government was set up is they couldn't impose taxes, right? Taxes were a hot button issue. Didn't want to talk about taxes, didn't want to deal with taxes for colonists. So they basically requested money from all the states. They made a levy upon each of the states and then let the states figure out how to pay it. And in a lot of cases, they simply didn't, right? The government, the Continental Congress, had no power to directly tax people. And this was one of those issues with how the first colonial government was organized that proved to be a real problem as the war went on. Because if you've read any serious history of the American Revolution, it's not just the military aspects of the war. It's the fact that the colonial government and the colonial economy came very, very close to economic collapse, right? It was only the very fortunate win of the colonists, the battlefield victory of the colonists at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 that brought the French into the war. And of course, that would bring military supplies, financing, give the colonists access to European banks where they took out very large war loans. We're going to talk more about those later when the Constitution starts to get formed. But now the colonists are like, whoa, now we've broken with England. Now we're in rebellion. Now we've declared ourselves a country. How do we make all this work, right? Keep in mind, of course, also in the back of your head, that George Washington is paying attention to all this, right? George Washington truly was, if you could pick one person that was the key to forming our country, one person to be truly the father of our country, it would be George Washington. And he's paying attention to how much time and energy that he has to spend going back to Congress to get money to supply and feed his troops during the war. This is going to be a very, very, very large factor, as we're getting ready to see. Really an unknown factor to a lot of Americans in the forming of our Constitution, right? But for the moment, Thomas Paine is trying to rally the troops. You know, the American Crisis, again, one of his more famous writings. A lot of people may know the first sentence. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. And then he goes on to say, the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. You've probably heard those phrases at one point or another. Read the whole document though, right? That's what we're here to do. Okay, he's trying to basically say, buck up, buckaroos, we got this. And how great is it going to be when we finally win our independence? Because we're going to be stronger, wealthier than England, than we could have ever been under English rule, right? Again, appealing to the Benjamins, so to speak, right? The colonists need to say, we just got to get through this war. We just got to get our independence, and then everything is going to be hunky-dory. We're going to find out that that's really not true, but he's trying to rally the troops. If you read the second letter, okay, this is from 1778. Now, it's important to take note here, right? In 1778, the colonists have been at war for 3 years. They're no closer to victory than they were. Neither are the British, of course, because as you've read, if you've read some history of the war, and again, excellent new book I'm reading by John Ferling, once the French and the Spanish come into the war, the British don't worry so much about the colonists. They're like, those guys, they're a bunch of jokers. They don't know what we're doing. What we really need to do is go protect our Caribbean colonies. And you'll see that the British right at the point where they could have really made a difference in winning the war, pull a lot of troops out of the colonies and send them down to the Caribbean to defend their Caribbean interests, which were economically much more important to the British than those knuckleheads with muskets in the colonies, okay? But the colonists are still looking at a collapsing economy, an inflated currency, economic deprivation, and no way to bring the war to a conclusion. And Washington is very sensitive to this, as is the Continental Congress, because they keep having to go back to the people and asking them for more sacrifices. We need more men to join the army. We need people to give food and supplies to the troops. We need the people to pay taxes to help finance the war. And they're basically saying, come on, little buckaroo, I keep saying this, come on, little buckaroos, buck up. And the war will drag on, right, through 1778 and 1779 and into 1780. And then the war shifts to the south, right? And we're going to see the final campaigns into 1781 with the American victory at Yorktown. But keep in mind, again, this was the point where the colonists very nearly lost the war because of not a military problem, but an economic collapse, because the central government, and we'll talk more about this when we start talking about the Constitution, didn't have the power to really do what they needed to do to wage war. There was too much consultation, too much bickering, too much that state's not doing their share. Why should we do our share? There was a lot of that during the war. And George Washington was paying attention. So was Alexander Hamilton. So was James Madison. So was John Adams, for that matter. All of these men were watching the struggles that the government had during the Revolutionary War, and they were storing it up here for afterwards, okay? So this week, when you read these two documents, again, it's important to keep the history of what's going on in their mind. This is the hard part of the war. This is 1777-ish to about 1781. This is 4 hard years of war, of inflation, economic deprivation, casualties on the battlefield, and no possibility of victory in sight for either side. But in the long term, a stalemate might have worked more in Britain's favor than the colonies, because there were definite undercurrents of the colonists to say, look, the French aren't helping us. The British are not giving up. Our currency is worthless. Our economy is collapsing. Maybe we should just try to figure out a way to reconcile with England. And there were a couple of moments in the war when it was seriously considered. Never really likely to happen, because there were enough colonists that said, no, we don't want to give up our independence. And the British were like, well, if you're not going to give up your independence, what's the point? But it was a very near-run thing. I think more of a near-run thing than a lot of Americans realize today. It was not inevitable that the Americans would have won, the colonists, the states, whatever, would have won the Revolutionary War. And a lot of it had to do with the weaknesses of their government and the fact that the colonists couldn't really be united, truly united, to fight the British. So read these two documents. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts next week of that first government, the Articles of Confederation, and why it became such a train wreck that the new United States decided they had to form a genuine constitution. Stay tuned. It's going to get good.